So hi everyone, welcome to Fostering a Healthy Remote Learning Environment for Educators and Students. So let's start off with a bit about me. So my name is Ruari and I am the IUA EDTL Student Associate Intern. I'm currently doing that alongside my Masters in Data Science at UCC. So I'd be part of a larger cohort of student interns, which would be spread across each IUA member university, and they'd be embedded in the EDTL team in each of those universities. So there's a good gang of us. We are always expanding. I think there's over 9 of us at the moment. So it's very handy just to get a diverse range of perspectives on the issues that students are facing in terms of remote learning. So it's been wonderful working with them for the last year and as well working with them over the summer going forward. A bit about the EDTL project. So it's funded through the HEA Innovation and Transformation Fund, and that's been extended now funding to September 2022. So the goal of the project is to enhance the digital attributes and the educational resources for university students, and we aim to mainstream digital in teaching. So obviously last March, the project really kind of ramped up a gear with the move to online learning, and we made a lot of changes very fast. So for example, we created a series of resources such as online webinars and infographics, which can be utilized by both university staff and students to enhance their own digital teaching and learning. Now on to today's presentation. So in today's presentation, we're going to be looking at what a healthy online learning environment looks like. A lot of this work will be coming from the work the EDTL team has been doing over the last few years, along with the student interns. As part of this approach, the EDTL project has always tried to put students at the center. And so because of this, there's a great deal of insight in the project into what students want from their online learning and how this can be achieved. So we're also going to look at the tools that we've all gotten so familiar with over the past year and how these can also be used to create a healthy online learning environment. Wellbeing is another area that I'm going to be touching on. I think as this year especially, it has really come to the forefront in terms of the media articles and as well as what we have heard on the EDTL team from student interns and student interns' other contacts, just as being an issue that's coming up quite a lot this year, and just how this actually plays a major role in healthy online learning environment, and it's quite easily overlooked. I'm then going to discuss the advantages of all of this for both educators and students, because there are many, and it's not just, you're not just doing it for the sake of it, there actually are very tangible benefits to creating this kind of learning environment. And then I'm going to, so let's move on to the next slide. So before I go into what makes a bad online learning environment, I'd just like to preface it by just a note that this year has really caught everyone by surprise, I think, both educators and students. And a lot of the advice here from students, it comes from a place of understanding rather than frustration, because students are well aware that for a lot of educators, the move online has been as challenging, if not more challenging, than it has been for us students. So I think that's worth keeping in mind, that students do actually empathize that it is very difficult for everyone involved, and there's not a kind of a victim complex that it's all bad for them, and that we know everyone's doing their best. So I just think that's worth keeping in mind going forward. So the first thing I'm going to speak about, just in terms of what can contribute to quite a negative online learning environment, is vague details. So detail can be a common casualty when we move online. So as well as missing out on the kind of the vital cues and information from classmates and lecturers, which students will have usually seen a good few times a week, there's also a lot of context-specific information that you wouldn't get just from being on campus. So for example, whether that would be just having small talk with someone saying, oh, there's an exam coming up next week. Just small things like that can really add up over time to students feeling lost and feeling quite stranded in terms of having direction with their online learning. As well as that, there's also, of course, the fact that students are very reliant on online worlds only, and it's not easy to get details from this always, especially from lecturers as well, which I'll cover more later under the communication bracket. So just when it comes to organization, in theory, the move to online should have made organization much easier, but for a lot of students, this actually hasn't necessarily been the case. So I know from my own personal experience that it can be very disheartening to log on to our virtual learning environment, or VLE, and just seeing big, huge lists of work and uploaded assignments to get through without any context or any guidance on how they should be approached. So that's definitely something I think which needs to be looked at more closely, just how we approach online learning and how we feed the information to students. Communication, which I touched on earlier, is another one of the areas which is very hard to get right in the online learning sphere, and probably quite understandably, because communicating online through Zoom like we're doing now was a novelty for so long before this forced into the limelight. So in a traditional college setting, most of my communication, just speaking from my own personal experience, would have been with lecturers at the end of one of their lectures. So, they've stand in front of class and you could go down and ask many questions. That would have been the bulk of my communication with them. But this isn't really possible online. And once you take this away, along with a lot of the other casual interactions you have with your lecturers, you're not left with much options apart from email. And I think, as I'll discuss later on, a lot of students don't actually particularly like emailing the lecturers because it can feel like quite a stilted and overly formal way of communication. So that's just the three areas I think that we'll probably be focusing on how we can improve, because I think once you work on those three, the online learning environment really does transform very quickly and in a very positive direction. So this is what I will be drawing on the majority of today's talk from. So if you are familiar with EDTL's work, you'll know that we have created several infographics for both educators and students over the course of the last year and a bit. So in these infographics, the goal of them is to break down individual areas of online learning and digital teaching and how you can enhance your own approach to these, as well as benefiting you and your students. So this will be our two ones here that I'll be drawing on. So we have the planning for effective remote teaching during COVID-19, the EDTL approach, which is EDTL teams, what they consider to be the best practices for digital teaching. And we also have our student perspectives infographic, which was created in conjunction with the entire student intern team from their own lived experience over the past year of online learning. So that draws from what they enjoyed from online learning and what they felt could have been improved. And it's basically, if they were face-to-face with a lecturer going into September and they were asked, how would you approach this year? This infographic kind of sums up what they would tell them and what they would like to see from their online learning going forward. So focusing in on the student perspective, if you read the infographic, you'll see it's divided into 5 different sections, each of which I believe form a major part of a healthy online learning environment. So a lot of the topics you'll see on the right-hand side here have received a lot of attention already this year. So for example, assessment comes up at the end of the semester, oftentimes, as well as communication, which I've already touched on. So these are great areas to focus on, and a lot of them probably were areas of contention throughout the year, especially assessments, controversy over proctoring and such. So they are crucial areas that really, when you get right, can be great benefits to your students. So I'm going to move on to those individually now. So I'm going to start off with effective communication. So on the topic of utilizing the VLE. So the VLE has become the central hub this year for student education. It's no longer just a place where a student would visit maybe once every few weeks just to submit assignments, but now it's become a one-stop shop for accessing lecture materials, getting feedback, and oftentimes asking questions. So this year especially, I think that the role that the VLE plays in effective communication is very, very important. So as I touched on earlier, a lot of students are actually quite intimidated by the thought of cold emailing the lecturer out of the blue with a question. So for a lot of students, I think, and myself, by the time they figured out if they should address their lecturer as doctor or professor or their first name, and they're probably still wondering at that stage if their question is even still worth asking, it can feel a very overly formal way of getting in touch with your lecturer. So naturally, students will have questions. And I think for this reason, if you try and push students in the direction of using the VLE for these questions, the results can be quite good. So for example, I know the VLE, the virtual learning environment that we use in UCC, is Canvas, and I know a lot of them have the same features. So for example, there's discussion boards. And by utilizing these discussion boards, students can post their question, and you as the lecturer can of course answer it. But it also introduces a new realm of potentially peer learning, as all the other people registered for that module can access it as well. So just like that, you're reducing your own workload, as well as allowing students to socialize and answer their own questions, help each other out, which is always good, because I know peer learning has been the emphasis up our lot lately. So furthering this point then, setting clear communication guidelines. So I think a lot of the anxiety students experience over wanting to communicate with the lecturers or other maybe authoritative figures on their course, it comes from maybe vague details about how they should go about this. So earlier on in the year, even in your opening lecture slide, if you just stipulate quite clearly the who, what, where, and when the students should use when they want to get in contact. So for example, if there's a teaching assistant on the course that you want to direct questions to, provide their details. And if you only want questions to arrive to you during working hours and not at 8 o'clock in the evening, stipulate that, because students actually, from what we've heard from the student interns, really do appreciate the clarity, and they know they're not bothering the lecturer, but instead are following all the right guidelines. So even just one slide in your introductory lecture, which just sets us all out very clearly, and you could do a lot going forward just in terms of clarifying communication, both from your perspective and for the student's perspective. So then take advantage of technology. So moved online, it's fair to say in some ways it's been quite a hindrance to kind of effective communication between lecturers and students. But this is not always the case. So during one of our webinars, I thought something was very interesting. One of our student interns brought it up, was how one of the lecturers does virtual office hours. So I thought this was very interesting. So what they would do is they would basically send out an email on the week saying, "Hi all, I'll have an open Zoom room or Microsoft Teams room from 3 to 4 on Thursday the 8th. Feel free to drop in and ask any questions if you have any." So the student intern explained that this is a great way of having a more informal way of having a face-to-face meeting with your lecturer, because instead of going through the rigmarole of trying to see when you're both free on each other's calendars and trying to find a half-hour, 1 hour block, just being able to quickly drop in, ask your question, maybe say your pleasantries and get out. It's a great way of just maybe not having the overly formal ways that video conferences can often feel like. So I think that's something to keep in mind as a good idea going forward. The final area then is around communication, and this is something which has been coming up since day one of online learning, I think, is trying to make synchronous lectures as effective as possible just in terms of communications. So I think that's something that we've heard a lot of, is that a lot of lecturers understandably find it quite disheartening when you're trying to give a synchronous lecture and no one has a webcam on, so you're just speaking to rows and rows of avatars. So people often bring up, should you maybe try and insist that students have their cameras on because it'll keep them more engaged and it'll maybe make them more willing to communicate and chip in. But from what we've heard as student interns and from our own personal experience, this actually probably does more harm than good. So for example, rather than saying, have your cameras on, maybe providing a gentle nudge and then just saying, if you want to ask a question, maybe just turn your camera on for the duration of your question. And it's going to be a nice way just to see someone's face and just to kind of bring more realism into the lecture hall as well. So I think rather than enforcing the rule, just a gentle nudge in the direction that having cameras on actually makes the lecture more enjoyable and more engaging for both parties. And it's especially for younger, say first year groups who might never have seen each other. And so they probably find the idea of turning on a camera and inviting a bunch of people never met into their working space to be quite daunting. So next I'm going to move on to digital resources. So as well as another advantage of online learning, I suppose, is that there's so many new ways to teach and learn that would not have been feasible before. So for example, on the VLEs again, there's so much features built in that take advantage. So for example, there's the quizzes. So I know that some people have taken advantage of them for assessment. So instead of traditionally doing the MCQ over Microsoft Word and asking them to tick the box, there's actually built-in features to the VLE. And students do prefer this because instead of wrangling with formatting on a Word document, it's quite simple. It's like going through a web form, you're just ticking the right option. So I think it's well worth looking into the resources available to you by the university through the VLE, where there are other external ones. So another resource that brought up, which I thought sounded very interesting earlier on in the year when I heard it, and we actually used it then a few months ago, is, just opening it up there, is these online quiz platforms. So these platforms allow you to basically set up a free online quiz, and you can then send the link around to people, which and you can send the link around to people then, and they can answer these questions live. So just stuff like this, and there's such a wide world of varied online learning materials out there that it really is worth looking into them and taking advantage of them, because for students, especially when they're at home for prolonged periods of time, just something which provides a levity and maybe changes up from the usual format can go a long way in just keeping students on top of things and motivating them. Yes. So another thing then I think is brought up about digital resources is the VLE itself. So some VLEs are quite easy to use. Like I personally would find Canvas quite easy to use in UCC, but even so, there's so many features to it. So for example, one feature which I discovered late on in the year, which I thought is very handy, is that if you go onto the Canvas calendar view, it actually drags in all your different modules, all your assorted deadlines, all the things the lecturers have set with dates on them. So you can see all these in one streamlined view. I'm sure across many VLEs there are similar features. And I know for UCC, for example, have done a great deal of work in making sure that the resources to learn about Canvas are there. And I'm UCD as well, have done this as well, I'm sure. So I think making an effort to make sure these resources are available to students and putting them in the front and center of your own module is worth doing, because the VLE is such an important part of here, as I mentioned, and ensuring that students are able to use it properly and use all the features to the maximum of their ability, I think goes a long way in just reducing stress and just making sure that you're not answering questions that are quite simple about Canvas or Brightspace or whatever you're using. So one thing then, the VLE is using the selection materials, assignments, and other materials that you would upload, is just making sure that they're readily accessible. So I think it can be quite tempting just to upload them and just maybe divide them maybe by whatever uploading block you've done them in, but this can actually be quite overwhelming for students. So one thing which one of my lecturers did earlier on, which I really appreciated, was just uploading them by topic, because not only does it make things a lot easier for revision time, it just means that when you log on, not spending ages endlessly opening up PowerPoints and PDFs and looking for the right one, and just makes it a lot easier, and you're saving a lot of time just able to get in, get what you want, and then get out. So linking into this then is the topics of roadmaps. So speaking from my own personal experience, the structure of a traditional college timetable is the one thing which I have missed the most in the move to online. I never actually, to go looking back, I never really did appreciate how much I would miss just having my classes and labs scheduled out for me months or weeks in advance. So like on a more mental note, this would have provided a natural and kind of a reliable pace to my learning. So I knew that I'd have 2 hours of lectures this week on this module, and we'd move along at the lecturer's pace. So in the online world, I think this is one of the things which is sorely missed by a lot of students. So just drawing from an example, in my first semester this year, one of my lecturers just uploaded, I was going to be a completely asynchronous module, and they just uploaded all of their lectures at the start of the year and just kind of let us go through them at our own pace. And I personally found this to be quite a stressful approach, just because even logging in on the first day and seeing a big long list of 40 lectures, maybe split up, was quite intimidating. And when I compare it to my other lecturer then, who would upload them by topic and maybe divide them down, it really does make a big difference, I think. And on topic of roadmaps then, one of the student interns actually brought up one of our webinars, how their lecturer, they did the same, they uploaded all the lectures at the start of the year, but what they did also was they uploaded a checklist. And on this checklist then, they had where you should be at the end of each week, and you could check off if you had done that week's work. And this was a good medium of wanting to maybe get the material up there so students can work at their own pace. But then for students who maybe like more of a guiding hand in their pace, just providing them with a resource, such as a checklist or a roadmap, maybe so they're not burning out if they feel under pressure to get it done too fast, or they're not left cramming at the end of the year if they struggle with time management maybe, and let it all build up. So just keeping in mind that making a roadmap for students can go a long way over the long term in stopping them from maybe getting overwhelmed or even taking the foot off the gas too early without realizing it's all building up later on in the year. Yes. So I think that covers roadmaps. So some on communication, again, I suppose plays another major part in roadmaps. So as I said, the loss of a learning schedule did play a fairly major role this year in a lot of my issues with online learning. But a lot of lecturers, to their credit, did make an effort just to say, by and large, I'm going to try and do a synchronous lecture maybe at 2 o'clock on Tuesday. And this oftentimes, would change, because I think for a lot of lecturers and for students too, when people aren't coming into college, there's not much of a reason why you should go out of your way to have a lecture if it's very inconvenient, because nobody's wasting a trip in or wasting a trip out. But for a lot of students, it can be quite frustrating, I think, when they carve out a block of time at the last minute, it's cancelled or changed. So one thing that the student intern team I've noticed, I've heard quite a lot of, is that last minute changes can kind of go a long way in kind of frazzling students and knocking them off kilter. So just notice, I think, is something to keep in mind. And if your plans change, that's fine, because we all have lives, especially this year, things are very much not set in stone. But just letting your students know if synchronous lecture is going to be moved or cancelled and give them as much notice, I think, is probably the way to go. Now, on the topic of assessment, which is a major thing this year, I think it's probably got a lot of attention in the media as well, because assessing students online has been something that's on a lot of our minds, especially when you hear a lot of horror stories as well. But that's not always the case. I mean, even in our work with the EDTL student interns, we've heard quite a lot of good news about how the move to online learning has actually forced a lot of modules to completely rethink how they assess their students. So one of these areas probably will be group work. So group work has become an integral part of many modules over the past few years. And it's understandable why, because I think it's fair to say that it translates very well to the real world of work. And it also ticks the boxes on pure learning as well, which is always good. And there's absolutely no reason why group projects cannot work well virtually by and large, especially as you see technology using today. Video technology has become so advanced over the last year, there's no reason why it couldn't be an effective form of assessment as well, virtually, even though we are going back to normal. So speaking from personal experience, I can draw on a very positive group work experience this year. So we had a module earlier in the first semester, and that would have traditionally been assessed in a more standard way. You go to the exam hall with the programming module and just write out what you'd answer questions with the programming language at hand, and that would be fine. But this year that wasn't really feasible, especially in the first semester. So instead, my lecturer said, for a change, what we're going to do is we're going to assign groups. You're going to work on a team software project together over the course of the semester and submit it at the end. So this was probably, for the lecturer's perspective, understandably, this is quite a radical departure from what he's used to. And I think, as far as the module goes myself, I found it to be incredibly beneficial. I mean, it's much more applicable to the real world, especially in my field, which is computer science, having to work in teams and having to work on creating projects. So I really appreciated that. And I think there's so much more scope as well going forward to look into new ways of assessing students, especially as a lot of people we are hearing a lot of that students really do not want to go back to the old way of doing things in these big exam halls and just having an entire semester worth of learning, trying to surmise that in 90 minutes. So this is definitely an area, I think, where a lot of work can be done, and it can be very beneficial for both students and educators. And I think students coming out of your module will come out with a much greater appreciation for what you have taught. Contracts are another area of group work. So I had a good experience with my online learning, but I would say that one thing which stuck out to me was how, when it comes to virtual meetings, some students, I think, do take liberties and do take advantage. So we had a group project as well in a similar module, and we were meeting once or twice a week. But some of the team said that it would suit them better if we met later in the evening. So oftentimes you're meeting at 8:30 or 9 in the evening, which, aside from my embarrassingly early bedtime, was very frustrating, because I think for a lot of people, in a real world, I would never be allowed that to happen in college. I just wouldn't have been in college that late. But I think when it comes to virtual, some people do kind of take advantage and take liberties to try and push other students into what suits them. So one thing that was brought up then, one of the student interns actually did this, was one of their lecturers utilized contracts. So at the start of the group project, they sent out a contract to each member of the team. And on this, then it will be, you should probably try and arrange your meetings during working hours, except under exceptional circumstances. I'll be checking in once a week with you all just to make sure everyone's pulling their weight. And if there are any problems, this is the process we're going to do if this team member is not showing up or not pulling their weight. And I thought that was a very good idea, because, again, clarity, which is something that comes up so often under communication, and as well here, the lecturers make it very clear early on what should be done and how it should be done if something doesn't go to plan. And I think this makes alleviates a lot of stress for students as group work goes on. So something to keep in mind, I think. Another thing worth keeping in mind then would be to keep the medium, take the medium into account, sorry. So as I said earlier for my module, it wouldn't have been feasible to have the traditional closed book end of year exam. And so for this reason, that module was kind of forced to pivot this year. But then for other modules, then some of our student interns have said, for example, they didn't change and they had a group essay and stuff like this. They were reported is very, very hard to get right over the virtual environment, which is understandable. It's not easy to divvy up work oftentimes like that. So taking the medium into account and providing more structured assignments and assessments can go a long way in just alleviating a lot of the confusion and the awkwardness of trying to divvy up work, which isn't easily done. So structure, I think, is something to take away just in terms of when you're assigning group work as well. And then there is, of course, the continuous versus end of term, closed book versus open book. So there was a lot of talk of this earlier on in the year about closed book, open book especially, and would universities bring in proctoring. I don't think much of it happened, because I think when you read the horror stories about proctoring, it probably is opening up a whole other can of worms. And it's also nigh on impossible then to kind of enforce a closed book exam remotely. So we've heard from several students that it's actually a bit frustrating when you have a closed book exam, because even if you abide by the rules, you take it on trust that everyone else as well. And if not, you kind of feel like you're missing out. So again, this would be something that would probably come from rethinking how you assess your module in the move to online. So maybe having a more exam that's based more on applying the knowledge rather than just repeating it would go a long way in making closed book exams no longer necessary, because as long as students applying what they've learned, open book shouldn't make a difference. And as well as this continuous versus end of year, as I touched on with my modules as well, it makes a big difference just to be continually applying your knowledge and getting feedback throughout the year rather than saving it up for one big, huge exam at the end of the term. So continuous assessment, I think, as well, is something that I personally, and as well the other student interns, and what we've heard from student survey and our own student voice survey, is something that we hope remains going forward. Now, well-being. So this is something I think which is easy to overlook. But this year, I think it's really become to the forefront. I think if you look at the media, you'd often hear stories about students feeling utterly adrift and disengaged with the online learning in to varying degrees. And so one thing which I've already touched on is consistency, and that goes a long way in well-being. So the traditional structure is gone as far as a lot of students are concerned this year, but trying to recreate it to a certain extent can go a long way in just keeping students engaged and making sure they know where to be, when to be, and what to expect coming up to assessment time. So whether this is keeping to a weekly regular schedule of synchronous lectures or ensuring that assignment feedback is regularly given back, this really does make a big difference to students, I think, just in terms of being able to monitor their own progress, as well as not taking their foot off the gas and just letting it all build up. Live lecture check-ins then. So live lectures, again, there are so many different ways to go about this. And it's probably quite difficult to try and do this as well when you are looking at a lot of people with their cameras turned off. But one thing which came up, which I thought was quite interesting, students were saying one of the lecturers at the start of each lecture would just ask them a simple question like, did you watch Love Island last night? Or how's the weather where you are? And instead of coming on the mic, just type your answer in chat. So a lot of students don't want to come off the mic. They don't want to turn on their camera. But the chat box is a very nice and neutral way to kind of foster engagement. And it's very casual, and students can do it no matter where they are, whether they're watching the lecture in the library or in a busy environment. So I just think taking advantage of other ways of checking in with students and making sure they're engaged in the lecture should be looked into. And the chat box is just one of these. And there's also, of course, reasonable accommodations. So I think, this year, especially you hear stories about equitable access comes up quite a lot, and a lot of students would have tricky with Wi-Fi. And so if a student comes to you with an issue, I think, whether I couldn't submit my assignment on time because of my Wi-Fi was down, I think it's important to keep in mind that for a lot of things, the student, that could feel like the end of the world for them, missing out on submitting an assignment. So I think it's just worth keeping in mind that this year has really taken everyone by surprise, and some students living out in the countryside may have very bad Wi-Fi, and you've seen the paper probably about students doing their lectures in parking lots to get free Wi-Fi. So I think that's definitely worth something keeping in mind as well. And furthering our wellness, you may have seen our Instagram account, which is at edtl.ioa, which is run by the student intern. And that's where we post a lot of our resources about wellness. So if you're looking for any advice or inspiration, we've run several campaigns there just regarding to mental health or how to stay organized when it feels like things are coming down on top of you. So at edtl.ioa, it's well worth a look just on the topic of wellness, I feel. So probably importantly, brings us on to the why. Why would you do all this? So more work is probably the last thing anyone wants, and this probably does involve a bit more work, but there's a key set of 3 advantages when it comes to making a healthy learning environment. So the first of these then will be happier students. So you're going to be empowering your students with this type of learning environment. They're going to feel more confident, they'll be more engaged with their work, and this can really going to be a good thing for everyone, I think. And there's also going to be a better understanding of what you teach. If you take away all the barriers that are there currently around communication, organization, and well-being, students will just be able to not worry about this and just be able to focus on the topic at hand and learning it to the best of their ability. So by focusing on better assessment as well, students will be able to say, hey, this is what I need to know, this is why I'm learning this, and just be able to apply it a lot better. So I think your material that you teach will be a lot better appreciated and understood by students. And then, of course, probably the biggest advantage for those here today will be less time spent on administration. So the sort of online learning environment that I think a lot of students would like is one where there's a bit of self-direction, there's peer support, and there's clear learning objectives. And when students know where to look for the resources they need, they don't need to email you and ask. When students can utilize the virtual learning environment discussion boards to ask questions, their classmates can answer instead of you or teaching assistants. And when clear rules about assessment and group work are set in advance, teaching staff are not called on for clarifications throughout the year. So I think there'd be less time spent just replying to emails, answering the same questions multiple times if you kind of take this approach. So I think a bit of time. So just punching a few different directions of resources. So we have our edtl.blog website, which is where all our infographics and webinars, which I touched on today, and plenty more are available there. There's our Twitter hashtag, which is IOADGED, and we have our Instagram account, which I mentioned, which has a lot of our student-led resources. So I'd be happy for any questions from any discussion there now. I think there's a few minutes left at the end.